because you're the politician. Cisco said that every state is unique, and he proceeded to say the gem of New Mexico, and then proceeded to say corruption. Well, I'm here today, though a resident of New York City, representing New Jersey, and I think we are unique, but we are known for corruption. And that's important here for elections, because I just want to begin, before I start talking through the legislative process that we're trying to engage in, to explain that New Jersey is one of the few states that is all DRE, at this moment paperless, though required by law to get a paper trail, and to explain to you the resistance and really the lack of activism, despite the fact that many of you in the audience know individuals from New Jersey who are active. There is only a small pocket of activists fighting against DREs or have been advocating for paper, coming out of Princeton and a small town called Montclair, where there is a high percentage of software and computer people. And the reason for that is the culture of New Jersey. A still vibrant tradition is hearing about absentee ballots being opened up over steam vats. And more recently, I tell you, out of the last election, we had 5 trials going on, one of which I participated, dealing with absentee ballot fraud. There's a tremendous resistance by local election officials who feel very protected by having a paperless election because of the history, and that's just where we are. So that I'm just trying to explain the environment I'm working in. It's a Sequoia DRE. They've been in the state since 1996. There has not been one of these crisis elections. And in one sense, the voter has felt more secure with the machine as opposed to the previous elections. And that was the environment that we're working in as people are becoming more aware of the unaccountability of these machines. And so there was luckily an ability through the 2 legislators that come from these 2 counties, Essex, where Montclair is, and Mercer, where Princeton is, got passed a VVPT requirement. And at the time that that bill was passed, the sponsor said, we as the activists, and I want to say I'm part of a coalition that not just focuses on this. It had emerged a broad-based civil rights coalition called Citizens Coalition for the Implementation of HAVA. That means that the issues that the coalition are addressing are broad-ranged, and currently the bill that you have in your packet, S507, is one of 6 bills that we've been pushing as a coalition. Others dealing with the matching requirements in the state-based, in the state election registration, uniform poll worker training, emerging language assistance for Asian, to get Asian Americans the right, in terms of having registration forms, ballots in such languages, inter-county provisional ballots. So the audit provision is seen now in the context of just the improvement of the administration of elections, and it's not just a single issue out there. Accordingly, the bill is being seen as broad-based, just improvement of administration of elections. And the sponsor of the original VVT made a commitment to do an audit bill, understanding the concept that what's a paper trail without an audit is meaningless. And so it was with the sponsor that we've been working. And at the same time, all the bills that the coalition has proposed, we have a relationship with the Association for the Local Election Officials. So all 6 bills went over to the local election officials, and there was an opportunity preliminarily to give comment. That didn't mean that they didn't get up at the legislative hearing and start opposing the bill. But the way the sponsor set this bill up was that she gave her time to Howard and myself. And it was presented as, this is what the experts say. And when everybody here is talking about how do you speak to legislators about the statistics, I just want up here, the graph is of New York, and more poignantly, in the paper that Howard, that has been sent out in your packet on voter verification on 18, is a graph of how many election districts would have to be audited to have a statistically based audit with a confidence level of 99%. And it was this is the way to speak, not in terms of statistics, but visually. This is the translation for the legislators and it's the translation for everybody as what this is going to mean. And we overcame a hurdle. Now that doesn't mean that there is resistance from the equivalent of the Secretary of State office, which is what we're now in the position of trying to work on. They are constantly trying to say that this is unpredictable costs, and they're just trying to see what this would mean if we had lower statistical confidence levels. And we are working with them, but every time we give them information, we're also stating our position conceptually of why the statistical audit is the appropriate audit. And so there are two issues. Well, given time, I wanted to go through our bill because walk you through the bill because many of the issues that came up throughout this conference, people said, well, we have to explore this. There are resolutions in this bill about triggers, the relationship with the recount, what happens when you deal with damaged paper. We actually, Howard and I sat down with local election officials, worked out the batching with absentee ballots due to the procedure in New Jersey where they're not designated by election district. We then made, they're in the bill, are operational compromises, which I think are good regarding allowing the audit to then be used in a recount, allowing the certain races to drive what election districts are going to be audited, so you're not opening up more machines, meaning that not every individual race is randomly selected. We're letting some of the races drive the other races in election districts that are going to be audited. Exempting races that have election districts with less than 100 election districts within it. So there were a lot of compromises that really were worked out when you actually sat down with election districts. With local election officials. A good slip. So the notion here, this bill has not been passed yet, but the key here is the willingness to sit down and work with the local election officials because there's a deference in the legislature to them on these issues. That's the other aspect that I sort of learned. Traditionally, election bills come before the legislature. They emerge out of the Secretary of State's office, in our case, the Attorney General's office. They emerge from a need of the local election officials. And all of a sudden, this bill is coming from someplace else. It's emerging from citizens, and they're all just puzzled. That doesn't mean they're resisting it, but there's puzzlement, and there's a lot of notion of, is this okay? And I think that by working with your local election officials, you'll get a better bill, and you'll also ensure that the bill will be enacted.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, we have New Mexico, and we have New Jersey, and we have Florida, Florida, Florida. Okay. It's an exciting election landscape that we have in Florida. It's been ever-changing and very exciting. Dan mentioned that I'm the Rules Committee Chair for it's the Florida State Association of Supervisors of Elections. And the way that works is that we have a committee that monitors the rules. We have as much input as anybody else does because we have rule-making workshops and the public is invited to come. Well, as the Rules Chairman, at the beginning of this year, after the legislative session, I started getting onto the Division of Elections saying, we need to work on this audit rule. It's really important, and kept after them. Now, in their defense, they had several rules which had an effective date way before this date. They had August 1st effective dates that they had to work on those rules. Don't worry about it. It's not until July 1, 2008. Wait a minute. This is a big deal, and we have got to understand what's going on. So you know what happens when you talk too much? You get a job. Okay, so it was, well, Susan, I got a great idea. Why don't you get together a group of your supervisors and then you can work on this. This would be really helpful. So I said, okay, we'll do that. So we had 17 volunteers out of our 67 supervisors of people who are really committed and wanted to talk about putting really meat on the bones of our new audit law, which is a page and a half. Now, once we started getting information in from other states and I kept looking at this law, I felt somewhat like Alice in Wonderland who had fallen into a big black hole and I couldn't get out. Looking at this, and looking at what other states were doing, I'm saying, how are we doing this? Is this meaningful? And then we got together as an association, the people who wanted to be on the committee, and Ion talked to you a little bit about how this law got on the books in the first place. It was kind of an afterthought. And Ina and I come from counties which are similar. His is a little bit larger than mine, but we'd be considered medium-sized counties. We can do this. This is not a problem. But when we got together with the large counties, they have some really difficult problems. Dan had asked me, what are some of the obstacles, what do the elections officials feel about this? No one's saying we shouldn't do it. No one's saying it costs too much money. No one's saying any of those things. The big question is, how are we going to do this? Okay? How are we going to do this? And is this going to be a meaningful, relevant audit? So we've been working through that, and our big obstacle, again, as I had mentioned to you earlier, is that results by precinct and the number of absentees and early votes that we have coming in. I mentioned that in 2004, in my particular county, 51% of the people who voted prior to Election Day. Now, the way I'm reading this audit law that we have on the books now is that we will have to audit the precinct, which is no problem, that's easy. And then we have to go to the early votes and go through and pick out all the ballots for that given precinct number. And then go, which in the presidential election, I think I had about 15,000 early votes and about 20,000 absentees. So we'll have to go through and pick those out. And then it occurred to me, well, if we're just going to look at them from the machine count, we're not really going to have a meaningful number. It just didn't seem to work for me. Having come here and listened and talked to several of you, I mean, it sounds like it would be better off for us if we would take a precinct and then we took the early votes separate, and then we took the early votes separate. I'm so glad to see you shaking your heads. I thought I was crazy. And then have it work that way. So we've got a couple of choices, I think. And initially, when we had our legislative meeting, it was, well, you know, it's an election year, and we're not going to get a lot of legislation, election legislation, because I don't want to rock about too much, ha ha ha. And so that's one way of looking at it. Then the other way is looking at it, well, you know, maybe we ought to go to them and say, you know, based on what we've learned here today and more investigation, and say, look, we think in order to make this meaningful, that we need to do something a little different. And so I think that that's the route we're going to take when I get back, talk to the association and see if we can't get them to understand that, you know, if we want to have something that's meaningful, then we have to do it differently than what's here. So wish you luck on that one, but because first I have to go to our legislative chair and then, you know, convince them that this is what we need to do. But, you know, as we had our meeting, we had a great meeting of the supervisors discussing, you know, how we were going to do this, and it became so apparent to me that there were some real logistical problems. Because again, in my county, when I had one ballot in English, Miami-Dade was going to have 4 ballots, but my one, because of the language requirements and because of the way their government is set up down there in their county. They have a lot of amendments and such. So they definitely have some other challenges that we need to recognize and figure out how we're going to do this that makes sense from a perspective of an audit and also from an election administration. So those are some of the things. As far as looking at it from a supervisor's standpoint, you know, we have to be so security-minded, and we really are, about the ballots. And so even that thought that someone might look at us and say, well, they're being very protective, we're responsible for those ballots. And so it's hard to shift gears. I just want you to understand exactly what we're thinking. And we've got chain of custodies in one sense, that we need all the security on the front side, and then on the back side, we can't just hand out the ballots and say, okay, you know, go ahead and do what you have to do with them. So these are some things that are very, very important to us as election officials. So those are some of the issues that we have. I think the election reality of letting elections officials know that, yes, they're going to be fair, honest, accurate, not perfect elections. That's it. And the public has to know that, and elections officials have to be comfortable with that as well. So, stop. Thank you.